So I would like to introduce Jo Davison and John Gregg. Welcome, and I will pass over to you.
Hi everyone, I'll introduce myself first, and then I'm going to hand rapidly over to John. So I'm Jo Davidson. I know quite a number of you one way or another. I was a Director of Children's Services for 15 years. I chaired the West Midlands Regional Workforce Committee and led the development of one of the first Memorandum of Understanding for agency social workers. And up until October last year, I was Chief Exec of the Staff College and part of the delivery team for, amongst other things, aspiring and new directors programmes. So it's really great to be here today. My experience is as much about what not to do when workforce planning as it is what to do, based on many different experiences. But I'm really pleased that John's been able to join us today, and he's going to lead, and I'm going to try to be his able assistant. So John, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so it's lovely to be here today. And Jo, thank you for that by way of introduction. I have to say that it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to follow in Jo's steps in the West Midlands in terms of being the DCS with responsibility for workforce, all things workforce. And one of my many responsibilities is to be part of the National ADCS Policy Committee
Just having a few issues with your sound, John. Sorry, we just got a bit of an echo there. I don't know.
Sorry, I don't know if that's any better. Yeah,
that's okay. Good. That's good again.
Okay, well, I was just basically saying how wonderful Jo was, and we'll probably just leave that there and move on. I think, you know, what I would say today is a starting point is there isn't a recipe or an instruction book of how to be a DCS. Every DCS job is different. The way it's constructed, the dynamics, the politics, the chief execs, all will make the DCS role very, very different, and there isn't a procedures manual to how to do it. So if you find yourselves in that role as a DCS, then it is a lovely position to be in, because you can create that role to be anything you want it to be. Okay, and in my position, I inherited Coventry when it was inadequate back in 2015, and I've taken it over the last 7 years for a journey from requiring improvement to most recently being judged to be good. And the golden thread for me in all of this was the workforce, because if you haven't got the people to do the work isn't going to get done, and outcomes of children are not going to improve. So we've had a real heavy focus for the last 7 years on workforce in Coventry, and just before the pandemic hit, we were down to 20 agency staff, agency social workers across the entire service, with a trajectory to exit all of those. And then the pandemic hit, and post-pandemic, we lost a significant number of people who were basically saying, just don't want to do it anymore. Life's too short, want to spend time with my family, leaving the profession, need more money, going to go to agency, you know, a whole raft of different reasons. So the presentation today is exactly not a presentation. Okay, so it's hopefully a bit of an interactive conversation on the basis that there are no rights or wrongs in this. It is just a navigation of an understanding of the shades of grey that make up the work that you do and the work that I do. So can we have the first slide? Are the slides up? Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, please. So basically what I've got for you today is just a selection of propositions. I don't know how I can see the slides and the people. Is that possible?
If you go to the view at the top right hand corner, you can usually
yeah
just change that so you can at least see part of the audience.
I've got thank you. So again, for the hour that we've got together, Jo and I were just going to guide you through, you know, a series of conversational questions on the basis that you know, as I've said by way of introduction, there are no rights or wrongs. So the first question was quite simply, colleagues, what do you think your role is as DCS in relation to workforce planning and development?
And if you either chip in or put something in the chat.
Okay. Setting strategy. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks. Essential. Okay. Setting vision and purpose. Lead and set the tone of the organisation. Thanks, Joe. Leadership, innovation, well-being. Anybody want to speak? Setting culture.
I guess there's something about the corporate colleagues and getting your corporate colleagues on side, particularly if you need to have some additional encouragement financially to get people to come.
So, Joe, I think that's a really, really valuable point. So I would say the first thing that I did when I arrived in Coventry, okay, at a time when there were about 300, so a workforce of 1,000, 350 of which were social work qualified. And I would say that on an average day, a third of them were newly qualified social workers, a third of them were old Coventry, been here forever, and a third were agency. So I think there were about 100 agency workers here when I arrived. So the first thing I did was I made it a corporate problem. It's not my problem. You know, we are spending £8 million a year of public money on agency workers. What are we going to do about that? So the first thing I did was we established a workforce board just specifically for children's services. And then I got the director of resources to chair it. So I made it a shared endeavor. So yeah, I think that was it was Joe that made that point, wasn't it? So yeah, that was the sort of the first point. Kevin, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it's quite heavily linked. I mean, I think it's important to have lead member and leader council sort of strategic objectives set, which for us in Kent is always, well, if you're doing it for children's services, why aren't you doing it for adults? And even growth, environment and transport and things like that. They want to have an academy for everyone and they want to have things for everyone. So it's not about treating one department preferentially. And there's always a kind of bad blood between departments because everyone perceives children's services gets more money or gets let off in the budget to go overspent and things like that. So you have to kind of have that strategic objective first and then do some negotiation at the top sometimes before you can then drill down and get down to what you've got. But you know, some members, since we've got outstanding in Kent, they said, can we afford to be outstanding?
Kevin, so, you can't afford not to be. So let's be really clear about this. In Coventry, the cost of failure was £13 million. So in the aftermath of the death of Daniel Pelker and the judgment of inadequate by Ofsted, £13 million was pumped into children's services just to keep it afloat. And that wasn't about improvement. That was just standing still, agency. You know, the cost of failure is extreme. So I think the narrative for you in Kent has to be you can't afford not to be outstanding. Because I think once you're in that place, there's a whole raft of additional efficiencies that you can begin to think about, because you can do stuff when you're good or outstanding. You can't even think about when you're inadequate or requires improvement, because you haven't got that depth. And in some respects, that's probably what's kept me in Coventry for as long as I have. When I arrived in Coventry, the narrative was very clearly from colleagues in place. You know, we make the money, you spend it. So I've spent a lot of time working with colleagues. So a lot of that corporate space has been filled with me sharing the realities of life in children's services. So a good example of this was I gave a presentation to the corporate leadership team on children's services. And I think they were expecting that I would talk about the work we did with children, but I turned up with a bag of Lego. And I set them a challenge. Okay, I literally gave each of the I literally gave them all 10 bricks and asked them to build a 10-story high building. And 3/4 of the way through the task, I said that the plans had changed They now had to build an 11-story building, but I didn't give them any more Lego. And they were just, what do you mean? And I said, well, that is the reality of what we face in children's services every single day. So you will start with a budget for X number of children who are looked after at the beginning of the year. And by the best of intentions, you can probably think about what the end position in terms of looked after numbers is going to look like. But what you don't know is what that final position is going to look like, or how many of those children are going to end up in residential care, or how many of those are going to end up at home or placed for adoption, etc. So I guess, you know, I use that as an example, but it was very much about setting this out as a corporate problem. Abrilli, sorry, did you have your hand up before?
Sorry, I'm on two screens. I could never get back, and you might see me looking like if I'm praying. It's because you're on the screen above my head. No, I was just gonna. I mean, to me, I'm not a social worker. I'm a teacher by profession, but I've done school leadership, and this is my first LA role. And you know, I've not sat in any meeting where they haven't spoken about the workforce in terms of children social care. But I equate our role as, you know, if we go into DCS roles as really ensuring that we have the resources, i.e. people, to ensure that children are safe. You know, ultimately, social workers are it's a really sad job. I genuinely empathize with all the social workers that I interact with. It's not the job where you get good news, you know, it's the job where you interact with sadness and really dark things on a daily basis, and keeping that buoyancy and that motivation and giving them what they need to do their job, for me, has to be the most essential thing for any DCS to do, so that children are safe, they're looked after, they're cared for, they're visited, you know, and we prioritize their care and provision. So for me, it's the same as, you know, hospitals or education. You know, leaders have an impact, but the people on the ground have the greatest impact: the teachers, the nurses, the doctors, the social workers. So, you know, if we're not doing that, we are in the most senior and strategic role. Our job is to keep the workforce buoyant, to keep you of us happy, retained, and recruited too, so that children are safe. I think that's the core job. That's my opinion, at least.
Thanks, Abrilli. I think you make a really, critical point. Really, that's really helpful. And the reason I say that is I'm going to ask a sort of a sub question now. Then for this one would be to say, what's the role of the DCS in relation to securing sufficient probation officers? Any thoughts on that, anybody?
I think Joe wants to come in.
Joe?
It's a really interesting one. We've just had our youth offending inspection in January, and I in a previous role before I became an AD, that was the reason I came to the council as head of service for youth offending. I was previously a probation officer. I trained to be a social worker many years ago when you needed to have that qualification to be a probation officer. And I guess when I came into the AD role, the former chair of the JOS board had just retired, and it was somebody within resources, so not in children's, because I think that's where youth offending was when I first came into the council. And myself and the head of service and the DCS had a big conversation about the need to get probation to chair it, and that secured us to get probation officers, because Becky chairs it, and can't, for the shamefacedness, come to the meetings and not give us the resource that we need. So there was a bit of a conversation about letting go of control of the local authority wanting to control things as we do, and that's been a bit of a coup, really, and I think that was fed back to us in terms of HYP recently, saying, you know, you're really lucky to have probation officers because not many other people do. And you know, it wasn't the only reason we wanted someone externally to chair it, but it was part of that thinking, really. So I know it's not really answering your question, but it was a bit of a deliberate move for us, really.
No, I think it does answer the question in part, Joe, because I think what I'm really getting at is that whole, you know, concept of external facing leadership or system leadership or being a conductor. So, you know, it's very easy, particularly if you've just come from being an AD, to try and be a super AD as the DCS, but you've got to have trust and confidence in your AD group and anticipate that they will lead and run children's services day to day, to give you the space to do that system conducting, I guess. There is, so for example, the reason I ponder the question about probation is because clearly it sits outside of local authority control. It doesn't have a great deal to do with children, but it absolutely interfaces with the work we do. So, for example, as a system leader, I need there to be sufficient probation officers in Coventry because they are managing the risky adults in the community who may or may not come into contact with my children, our vulnerable children in the city. So in some respects, they're another safeguard. They're part of the safeguarding infrastructure, aren't they? They're out and about. They see children. They see families. They know which risky adults are coming out of prison and where they're going to be living. So without sufficient numbers of probation officers, you're in that difficult difficult space. Maybe bringing something a little bit closer to home, picking up on maybe some of the points that Brilly's made. What about speech and language therapists or educational psychologists then? Because we get lazy shorthand, don't we? Burning platform with social workers, but the role of the DCS is so much more than the narrow focus of social work.
Can I speak? I can't find
Yeah, please. Sorry, Ashley, I am looking at the chat, but I was trying to focus on hands, the slide, and the chat. So yeah, please go ahead, Ashley. Yeah.
Thanks, John. I mean, I guess for me, the answers to the second question and the third question about probation officer and speech and language therapist is linked to the first question, obviously. I mean, for me, I think the DCS people is the most important thing, isn't it? And I guess the role is different everywhere, as you said. And if we think that part of the DCS role is about improving quality of outcomes, and part of it's around managing financial situation, what people are the most important thing in terms of improving outcomes, and they're probably also 85% of spend. So as you said, it's a really big thing, and I guess that part of the role of the DCS is what you said about being the system leader. It depends, doesn't it, on what happens to be the situation in the local area that one is the DCS, because in some places the probation service will be fully staffed and fantastic, in other places it won't. Similar speech and language therapists. So I think it kind of depends. But whether it's the role in the safeguarding partnership, or whether your role as a key member of the integrated care board, or whatever it is, it's that system leadership role, I think.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, some really good points, which I think probably lead us into the next slide. But before we go there, Andrea, have I got your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't turn my mute off. No, just going back to your comment about speech and language, I think that's really critical, and not just as an individual role, but thinking about that across the system. And we are doing a big piece of work around SEND, but obviously we all know that the SEND inspections, it's a system inspection, and the interface between all of the partners and the offer to our children is absolutely critical. But what we have seen is if we don't get that right, then our children, I'm thinking particularly around our youth justice cohort, I have responsibility for youth justice as the assistant director. Those young people are struggling to communicate, they're struggling to understand communication, and that then leads on to your other example around moving into the adult world in relation to probation and requiring those services right the way through their adult life. So I absolutely hear what you're saying in terms of our system approach to that as aspiring DCSs, but it also is definitely a role within the AD as well, responsibilities around some of the partnership meetings that we sit in, and understanding the pressures of the workforce across the partnership and how it impacts on children's social care, early help, SEND, education, etc., etc.
Can I just come in quickly, John, on that,
Joe,
just as we go into the next slide? There's a really brilliant resource that we'll make sure is in your learning portal from the Association of Directors of Children's Services, and it just really reinforces the fact that the Director of Children's Services and their partners and senior teams, but the DCS role has got a unique responsibility to ensure that the total children's workforce and associated people is sufficient to meet the needs of the children, young people in the area. So I think the conversation that you're all getting into, which is actually this is way outside one individual profession, is the one to really, really hold on to. That in your DCS role, you're looking at the total children's workforce and using all your influence and power to make sure that all the partners understand the responsibilities, whether that's workers that work with the adults or workers who work with children, and that includes the schools as well. So if you haven't got enough head teachers, that's really going to affect your education system in your place. So you've also got to have a weather eye on that. Should we move on to the next slide, John?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I am sort of half keeping an eye on the clock. This is the trouble with this conversation, is it's something that I'm quite passionate about, is quite dear to me. So there's a couple of comments I'll come back to in the chat, but the second question is around the role. Is the role different depending on where you are a DCS? And I think we just had a little bit of that from one of the previous contributors. Any thoughts on that? Is the role different depending where you're DCS? So I think Ashley made a few points about of that nature. Ronnie?
I put this thing in the chat. I think it depends on how you understand your communities, how you understand your data, the needs of your communities, to ensure that you've got sufficient of whatever that is, and that you've got that kind of integrated approach to how you've identified need and responded to it as a system. So I think it is different because everywhere is different across the country. There are some core, as you refer to it, golden threads that thread through the statutory functions of a DCS. But I think you've got to be able to also to respond to the place that you're in, and the needs are not the same in every part of the country. So it is different, I think, and it's also about how things are configured. So the role I'm in East Riding, it's very different to my experience in Bradford or Kirklees in terms of what that role covers. So I think it is different.
Okay, thanks, Ronnie. Zoe?
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd agree with what Ronnie says in terms of contextual information, but also I think what impacts the role is the Ofsted journey. So I've had conversations with chief execs about what they're looking for. And if I'm going towards an inadequate authority, what they're looking for is very different to what an authority who are good are looking for. And that's really stark. That's something I hadn't sort of thought about in detail. But when I'm talking about what your priorities are, the two completely different things depending on that Ofsted journey. So you've got that, but you've also got the contextualization of the authority that you're looking at as well. But that's what's jumped out to me, that the chief exec's priority are totally different depending on where the Ofsted journey is at.
I mean, that's a really, really good point, Zoe. I think, my experience, I mean, we've seen this nationally, right? The Children's Services portfolio is what is going to get the chief exec sacked. It's as simple as that, isn't it? So you come to the table with that as either as an experienced DCS moving, around the country, or when you pick up your first role, having been, for most of you, having been an assistant director and then making that step into your first DCS role. I guess reflecting on my own experience, I'd say my role has evolved in the 7 years as I've been in Coventry, as you would expect. But when I first arrived, we were overdue an inspection. We were still very clearly inadequate. Children, I could not be assured that children were safe or safer. I didn't have enough people to do the job. There was a level of denial within the council about where they were on their improvement journey. And day to day, I think I was probably operating in the AD space, if I'm honest, as in dip sampling cases, doing audits, visiting teams. I was in the weeds, absolutely, getting down and dirty with the troops every single day. And, on top of that, I was trying to do the role of the Director of Children's Services as well. And that's probably why the job became sort of a 70-hour a week endeavour, if I'm honest. I think I probably averaged, the first year, I probably averaged somewhere between 12 hours a day and a little bit at the weekend. So sort of a 70-hour, but the service was inadequate. I could not be, it was on my watch, and I could not be assured that children were safe. That even the ones that we'd taken some responsibility for. So I think the role is different. And I think between that, on that continuum, that swinging between director and assistant director, there was a big time I was probably operating in some kind of deputy director role, with a foot in both camps and holding, the service with one hand, but trying to play in that corporate leadership space as well. So I think you're absolutely right about, depending where you're on your improvement journey. But I think there are some other structural factors as well, in terms of, what as DCS you have system responsibility. How did that work with the AD impo? I got rid of them all. There was a mass exodus in Coventry, put it that way. It was, I'll be honest, what I did is I rebuilt the service, and that meant that there was a period of time when there was me, and there were about 1, 2, 3, somewhere in the region of 6 interims. And the irony of this all is, you'll love this bit, because I didn't. Most of them were earning more than me on a day rate. But you had to do what you had to do, didn't you? So yeah, it was an incredibly challenging time, but something that I look back with very fond memories of. My wife was saved through rose-tinted spectacles, but the hard work's done now, so should hopefully reap the reward. Kevin, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to talk about the politics, because I think that massively has an influence on whether the politicians reflect the population in terms of diversity as well. I think that can have a massive impact. And I've also learned that depending on the cycle of elections, actually your window, because of PERDA and giving people that come in new their induction, actually your window for change is really small. So you end up, your timeline of what you want to do doesn't marry up with the political timeline of new people going out and things like that. So you can't actually marry up the timelines. So when you want to change things, we can't bring that to decision, because actually members of the public are going to be thinking about who they're voting for from January to March, April. So we don't want to publish that yet. But that means I've got to wait 6, 7 months then for making a change then. So how you how the political alignment is in that local authority compared to the timeline of actually doing things can be completely mismatched, and then that falls in your head, sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Kevin. Do we think there are any votes in children's services?
No.
There's lost votes.
I mean, it was, there was a, even if you're thinking about, I'm struggling to think of a local authority where the leader went, or there was a change of colour of politics as a result of something bad that happened in children's. I'm sure we must be able to
there have been
find
a small number, but not many.
But I suppose the point I'm making to Kevin is, I think you're absolutely right in that navigating the politics is a critical point of the role, and I guess my personal reflection is that I have a really, really good lead member for children's services, and she and I are two sides of the same coin, and you wouldn't get a cigarette paper between us. And that means I probably don't service her as much as I maybe would need to if that was a different arrangement. She and I have worked together for a number of years. I think there's a level of trust and respect. But I can see that, if that were to change, I would then have to, you'll be doing quite a lot of backpedaling to get back up to speed in terms of managing that interface with a politician who might not be as aligned to things as I would want them to be. So yeah, you give me something to think about to today as well. I suppose, to be fair, in the early days, I did a hell of a lot of engagement with elected members. Again, I made it their problem. It's not my problem. It's, you're the corporate parent for all these children. You're the elected members. I made the leader of the council, made him my best friend, lead member, made it her problem. So those, when, and then we're sort of in a position now where if I go and see the leader, if I rang up now and said, I need to see the leader, can I come and see him in 10 minutes? That'd be yes, because he'd know that I'd be only seeing him because I really needed to. So I suppose it's about just managing that relationship in the context of where you are. So I think that probably answers the question what's on the screen. We'll move on in a minute. Joe, did you want to come in? And then I'll go to Ashley.
Yeah, just quickly again, I think that point about engaging politicians is really key, but it's not just about engaging the children's or just the leader. Where you draw your workforce from and how you retain them is as much dependent on the economic environment that your place is based in. So I think there's also a lot of work that as DCS you need to do with the people that lead on jobs, skills, economy, to help them understand the role that the public sector and within that the children's sector plays in terms of the jobs market. And the other thing I would just say is think very carefully about what is the DCS operational role on workforce versus what is the member role, because it's ripe for confusion. And sometimes you find as a DCS, you're trying to get political approval for something that if you step back and think, just a minute, I don't need political approval for this. They might need to know I'm doing it. And I want a sort of a bit of politicians, oh yeah, that's a good idea, but I don't actually need their approval for it. So it's always really worth thinking that through.
Ashley.
Thanks. Just in terms of votes, are there any votes in children's services? I work in Richmond and Kingston in southwest London. I mean, my experience of that has been that more so around education. So if the schools are really good, then the politicians love to get on the back of that, and it could be a bit of a vote winner. And they're really worried about schools being less good. And ironically, of course, over time, one could argue that the ability of local authorities to control education, given academisation, is actually decreasing. But obviously, politicians would still like to have a role in that. But I guess it plays to your point that actually the DCS's role, and Joe made the point, that it is about the entire children's workforce.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's that. And then the other thing I was going to say was just about when you were talking, John, about having to roll your sleeves up and do the job of an AD yourself. I guess that's one of the challenges in these sorts of strategic roles. It's an issue of short-term needs and long-term objectives, isn't it? Because I mean, developing the workforce can sometimes take a very long time. We talk about speech and language therapists, for example. I mean, sorting that out, which is a massive national problem, is going to take a very long time. And at the same time, depending on where the local authority is, there's obviously a need to do something much more quickly than that. So I guess in a DCS role, it's always that balance between short-term crisis and long-term strategic planning. And sometimes people don't free up enough time to do the long-term strategic stuff, and they spend probably disproportionate amount of time in the short-term crisis management, which then doesn't solve the long-term problem, would be an observation.
Yeah, no, really, really good point, Ashley. Thank you for that. In relation to the point about schools and the politics, I guess thinking about what does a DCS do in relation to workforce. I guess one of the ways in which I judge my own success is almost sort of through the number of relationship-based conversations I'm having in a week, or how many coffees, how many times I've been out for coffee with somebody in a week. And that might seem simplistic, but I think for me it really brings home the fact that you are leading a system. You're a conductor. I spend more time telling people what to do that I don't manage. Right? And I'm being naughty now because I don't tell them what to do. Do I? I influence and persuade. But I'm effectively conducting the system. So I'll go and have a conversation with. We've got a new police project starting, and I would really quite like that aligned with our early help. So I invested half an hour in a coffee with a local chief inspector who's leading this project. Now, even though normally my relationships would be with his line manager, you know, the local police commander, but you know, he's leading this project. So I said, you know, I'm interested in this. Let me find out, how can we work together on this? You know, having grappled with it, I've now handed it off to head of youth offending. They're going to now turn it into some kind of operational project, and we're now benefiting in Coventry with 12 extra police officers as a result of that half-hour coffee. You know, so it's that kind of, you know, that kind of constant, you know, conducting or stirring the pot. Let's move on to the next question, because I'm conscious that we're sort of there we go. That's building on question 2. It's almost like we planned this, Joe, isn't it? Does the Ofsted judgment affect how you do the role? We've touched on this a little bit. Any more comments people want to make? Andrea.
I was clapping rather than putting my hand up. No, I think it links in with your comment earlier on about the role of the DCS and dropping into that AD role as well. And I think in terms of where you are as an Ofsted judgment, I think as a DCS, I would imagine, and certainly I've experienced this, is how much more hands-on DCSs feel that they need to be. And I'm just reflecting on what that job would look like for me. Because if you are a detail person and you are reassured by the detail, then I think there's a real challenge there, isn't there, in terms of how you get involved as a DCS in the operational world, or how you don't get involved in the operational work, but you're assured. And I would imagine, well, I know, depending on where you are on that Ofsted journey, I think that's really, really difficult to get that balance right. Because your description, what you've mentioned there earlier on, which is I put the question in about what happened to the AD, because there is something about having trust in your leadership team, that they are doing the do, but also that they have the detail that they need, because that can be quite brutal, can't it, in terms of the interrogation that you experience. So I suppose I'm not answering your question, but I am saying that I think it really does depend on where you're at in that judgment, at that journey, but also the individual approach that DCS has taken. I've seen so many varied approaches to this, where very much hands-off, very hands-on. I think it does depend on the relationship between the DCS and the senior leadership team, and the trust, but also the assurances, and how as a DCS you can be assured about if you are a detail person.
I mean, I think although I think you've made a really important point there. We must try and hold on to is that tension between having that system overview role as a system leader, but also having sufficient assurance that what's going on in your own organisation is good enough. So, I'm going to be having a conversation with a chief exec elsewhere later this week. I've been asked to do a sort of a support and challenge thing, and the question that I'm going to ask them is, you know, because they keep saying they're good, right? They keep saying they're good, and I'm like, but you've not been inspected for 4 years, so how do you know you're good? You know, you're good on the day that Ofsted left the building. You're good 4 years ago. How do you know you're good today? And I'll be really interested to hear that. Because I don't think he's got line of sight in terms of that assurance, but he should be getting that assurance through his DCS. So I guess as the DCS, how do you get that assurance that you can then give to your politicians and the chief exec when it's required? And I suppose I'm always reminded of a local authority I worked in years ago. The fastest exit of a senior manager I ever saw was on the day that she misled members. When she said something was going to be all right, and then Ofsted turned up and it wasn't. It was as simple as that. I mean, I don't think she even had time to get a coat. So I think it's really important that you hold on to that overview system role, but at the same time have that confidence in terms of what you're being told. So how do I do that? Well, periodically I'll join the senior leadership team for audit activity or quality assurance visits to to an area team. So, you know, once a quarter, the leadership team will go to one of the social work area teams, for example, and they'll spend a day there, and they'll look at, and they'll do so one of them will go out on a couple of visits with a social worker. One of them will spend a day dip sampling cases. Somebody will be given a couple of audits to do. The lead member will come and she'll just sit with staff and chat to them as in a welfare role. How's it like? What's it like working here? And I'll maybe join them for a couple of hours and just dip into what some of that activity is. And then, you know, that forms part of our QA framework. And I guess increasingly I'm dependent on the QA framework to determine what I know about the service. We've invested heavily in knowing ourselves well. So I'm confident now that because we know ourselves well, when I'm asking people to tell me, they're telling me an accurate picture, and that certainly was picked up in our most recent Ofsted in that we do know ourselves well. But that wasn't developed overnight. That was an evolution of a quality assurance framework that is now, you know, very robust and will ensure that we have no surprises if nothing else. And I've also, you know, I've got credit in the bank with the politicians, so I can tell them. You know, I can tell them when it's going wrong. You know, I think my first appearance at Scrutiny back in 2015, maybe beginning of 2016, when I told them just how, you know, rough it was, if you like, they were like silence, and then they were like, "Oh, thank you for your candid and honest appraisal of the service." And that just made me wonder what they've been told before. But it's digressing slightly. Magella.
I think that, you know, the question is absolutely. I think even Zoe, if you think of your DCS and managing sort of that organisation and your Ofsted judgment to going into Bradford, absolutely, you know, how that will be done is two very different things. So if you're good or outstanding, you're on that journey, you're pretty confident in your systems, processes, your quality assurance, but then going into, say, an inadequate authority, yeah, absolutely. And I think, Joe, what you said about being on the balcony and the dance floor, it is. But I think also it depends on your ability as well. And I think, you know, some of the honesty about, could you go as a new DCS into an inadequate authority? You know, when we saw the Bradford job out, I just thought, you know, I hope somebody really, you know, confident, competent, absolutely can, you know, give it the best shot, because Bradford needs that determination, isn't it? But it's, you know, it's a very brave to take on. I think as a DCS, and you have to know your own ability to be able to think, can I do it? Is it right for me? Is it right for the organisation? So yeah, I think it is the size of the organisation as well. What you would do in a small organisation as a DCS will be very different when you know, a huge county council. And I think it's something you have to think about in terms of your own skills, the leadership team, and what that organisation, sort of what's the plan for that organisation.
Okay, thanks, Magella. Kevin?
I don't know if I agree with how you do the role, because I think the thing about Ofsted, it's a minimum standard, and they regulate us, but they don't know themselves what that's really outstanding looks like. I think the danger a lot of local authorities have is that they try to meet the regulation standard and then they fall quite below, but actually they should know what the best thing is for children. Full stop, that's your job. And I think with Ken, I created the QA framework for Ken and the practice framework, and I didn't look at the Ofsted qualification of what good or outstanding was. Firstly, they don't even give a national standard around QA. You have to think, why is that? So the fact is that the fact that you have to kind of have your own standard of, like you said, John, knowing yourself. How do you know yourself? And what my experience has been of Ofsted is that the reason we're outstanding is because they didn't tell us anything new. And they could also see the innovation to do with things. They could see that the QA framework would find something, and then we were creative in trying to adapt. And so I didn't need Ofsted to tell me that, or there's nothing you can see in the Ofsted regulations that says this is how you do it, or this is what we're looking for. It's all about responding, isn't it, as a leader? And that's what I think. I don't think that's got anything to do with how the Ofsted judgment made Kent think. We just knew that we have to know ourselves, and we've got a responsibility to adapt if we see something's wrong. And I don't think that's got anything to do with the Ofsted judgment.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Johnny, and then we'll move on after Joe.
Hi, John. Thanks. I think this is a really interesting question to pose, actually, one I've often pondered throughout my own career. So, you know, quite often I find if something's inadequate, leaders will tend to come in and say, right, we've got no time for any principles, no time for working together. This is the way it is. That's how it's going to be. I'm the leader. I'm dragging you through. Quite often they do, because, you know, for a number of reasons. But it seems that principles get abandoned in that situation. I suppose it depends why it's inadequate. What's the culture? Are there low expectations, or are there different reasons for it? And then the question is, if it's good or if it's outstanding, do you pressure people to keep that grade, or do you, or do you get complacent? Do you move on before Ofsted come back because the framework has changed? I think I'm talking more about the education world, where I've seen head teachers play that sort of Ofsted game, if you like, hop around, jump around, get a school from RI to good, move on before it starts getting shaky, go to another school. And so the question is, does Ofsted drive your leadership, or do you have your leadership principles that can be applied in all sort of senses? And Ofsted will say, don't run a school for Ofsted. The same would be for children's services. I mean, I've been part of an inspection, ILACS inspection, that has said you've focused too much on compliance, for example. So I don't think even Ofsted want you to run it for Ofsted, but nonetheless, it is something that's there. So I guess these are the things that leaders need to grapple with, isn't it? That what is, and I think if we link back to your first question about is the role of a DCS different in different areas? If the core purpose is about safeguarding children, then I suppose every DCS role is the same. What's different is the context within you work in and how you approach it. So I think this is a really good sort of question to reflect on in terms of our leadership. I would like to say that your principles should be the same and your approach should be the same, no matter what the grade is. And then there shouldn't be an excuse for abandoning principles because of what the judgment is. You can still get something out of inadequate if you're principled and hold people to account, and that you set the tone and the ethos for what you want. You don't have to slave people to death just to get over the line and then go, right, we've done that. So for me, that would probably be my approach. Ofsted is the guidance that allows us that we should be aware of and that we should plan and prepare for, but within the wider context of our leadership principles and what our core purpose is there for, which isn't what Ofsted, the framework, but is about safeguarding children and giving them a good deal. I hope that's made sense. I think I've waffled on a bit.
No, not at all, Johnny. I wish I'd had a conversation with you in the preparation for today, because I would have poached that question. Do we run services for Ofsted? You know, I think that's a really, really, really good question to think about. And in terms of today's discussion, I mean, obviously the questions I'm posing, but I suppose I've posed them in the context of a discussion around workforce in its widest sense. And I certainly didn't mean for us to get caught up on Ofsted per se. I guess what I was really...
I think it's connected, John. Sorry but I think it's connected, because I guess the point I was trying to make is that if it's inadequate and you have the type of leader that comes in and says, right, we need to get out of Ofsted, I think that impacts on your workforce planning, because I think it goes out the window a little bit. I think your primary focus is to say, Joe? How we get there, we just want to get there.
Yeah, can I come in on
please,
on
Joe.
this, and then we'll move on. I think so in relation to a couple of things that people have said and things that are in the chat, absolutely spot on. As a director, you set the vision and values and principles, and if you only stick to Ofsted, then you're not going to get very far with that. You're responsible for all children, and you're responsible for their outcomes. You're not just responsible for one bit of it. And some of the reason why there's such an issue around the SEND world, for example, and the inspection findings there, is because some places have lost sight of actually we're responsible for all children and their outcomes. We're not just responsible for some subsection of children. So there's some really clear fault lines running across the Ofsted findings that, you know, DCSs are looking really, really carefully at. But the Ofsted judgment is an important part of the environment that you are working in and that you move into. And I think that point about you take it as so what's this telling me? I need to make up my own judgment. But if I've got an outstanding service or I'm looking at a group of outstanding schools, exactly that point about, but what does that mean about the workforce? Are they still hungry for, you know, improvement, or are they complacent? Actually, how old is that workforce? Does the workforce represent and reflect the communities that they're working in? All those workforce questions still come in, but with Ofsted as just one frame of reference for that. But absolutely stick to your principles, stick to your values. That way you get really effective workforce change in the medium to long term as well. But you do have to command and control sometimes, but not for as short a period as you can manage.
Okay, we'll move on because we are rapidly running out of time. We'll go to question 4, but just to finally on that, when the slides talked about Ofsted, I guess really the question was about operating in a system that's broken versus operating in a system that's healthy. And I guess, you know, for me, that's the difference between inadequacy and outstanding. Let's move on a bit. So you know, my next question is, what do you do day to day? So let's just try and pull it back a little bit in the context of workforce. What do you do day to day? Temperature check. Ashley, tell us a little bit more about
that. So I guess you know, one of the roles of the DCS is to understand what's going on across the whole system, and being out and about and talking to people, as you said, you know, you do often with people who you don't line manage is a really important part of that. And then, you know, if one senses that temperature isn't how one would want it to be, then it's about following it up with, you know, those people who are responsible for that area, for example, and then tying it into the whole workforce strategy, which might be overseen by someone else again. You might have a AD for workforce, or might be, depending on the structure of the local area, you know, might be someone, you know, inside or outside the local authority. But just having a feel for what's actually happening in the workforce, given the workforce is probably the single most important thing that you're responsible for, and are going to be, you know, the controller of whether you're successful or not successful, is really important.
Thank you, Ashley. Joe.
Yes, it's that thing about setting the tone. So I think that, you know, the opportunities, and I'm just thinking about obviously the care review at the moment, and some of the concern in relation to IROs. So, you know, Heather, my DCS, I tech lead on the workforce development, but we went to meet with them following the first release of the care review, talked about their concerns, talked about what our view of them was, and then following that up. So last week, Heather's had a direct comms back to them about, you know, we're pleased to see that this is the position. And there's just something about how you take opportunities to communicate. And I think things like that have made a massive difference. You know, they've been the reason why some people have taken a decision to convert from agency to permanent roles, because you're not just saying this is how it is, they're actually seeing this is how it is. And I think that's something that's really important and doesn't have to be all consuming, but, you know, needs lots of, you know, you have to be always on it, I guess. But Heather doesn't get involved in the day-to-day stuff, you know, that sits with me, but her presence as a DCS really sets the tone and culture, I think, and the staff can see that across the piece. And she's a head teacher by background, not a social worker.
I think John's frozen by the look of it. Yeah, okay. I'll pick up then while he joins. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, Joe, about the role of the DCS in that context. Other thoughts from people? either put it in the chat or shout out. Kevin.
I think it's really important that leaders are visible, and I think what John reflected already about spending time with practitioners and trying to get a sense of himself. It's not just that. You know what we do in Kent. We observe practice quite regularly, senior leaders, and then what we've learned is that there was too much of an going from bottom up approach in our area management meetings, and we're expecting a director and management team to kind of come up with solutions, but actually it wasn't about that. It was about the directors finding the observations themselves and clarifying what the bottom was saying, and then putting the challenge back to the middle bit to say, I've seen what you've said, there's some context, I agree with you on this point, let's think of a solution. And what we found is that that's had more of a stronger, that space to reflect, having a purposeful meeting for a couple of hours, which then looks at what the challenge is and getting some innovation about how to address some of the points. That I think that's really important. If you don't do any top, I know it sounds weird to say top down, but you've got to do top down of what was coming up. You know what I mean? You can't just do top down completely. There needs to be negotiation. I think that's what I've picked up on. That's got to be part of your day to day, checking in, but then really checking in and putting it back to people that should be finding answers to give them.
Thanks. Apologies. I lost connection, but I've rejoined now, so I've missed some of that conversation. We'll move on to the next question as we come towards an end of the session. But just on that last point, I guess there's a few points I'd make. One would be, I heard somebody mention the word engagement. I think that's critical. So you looking to engage with the workforce. So the way I do that is I have a number of forums. So every 6 weeks I have an open door session where you can effectively just book and come and see me, right? So and I'll get people come in and they just want to have a chat about, sometimes it's what's going on in their in their work, or sometimes somebody's wanting to talk about what might be happening in the future, whatever. So there's a constant arrangement with like a formal open door session. Obviously, I'm relatively accessible in terms of being in work, but then on top of that, I hold every month we have a Let's Talk Children session, which I do via Teams, and we get several hundred people dialing into that, and we'll do it as a little bit of a briefing, but I do it in an interactive way. I'll start by saying, right, come on, let's have some of the positivity. What's going on in your areas of the world that I might not be aware of? Put that in the chat, and it turns into a bit of a celebration. I have a system of good job cards, which when I first arrived, I used to write these good job cards every morning on the train on my way into work. And then with the pandemic, we managed to digitize it, and people now get an automated card in their inbox from myself if they've done a good piece of work that I'm aware of. So people are now feeding that up, and I've been writing back to people. But I think the two other points I'd say was that is that spend some time to understand the workforce. So if you've got a good HR department that provides you with a decent HR dashboard, then take time to study it, understand the dynamics, the protected characteristics of your workforce, the gender split, the age profile, the experience of your workforce. So for years, I've had the least experienced workforce in the region, in the West Midlands, and that's because we've had a strategy of just bringing in newly qualified social workers as a strategy for how we would reduce our agency workforce. So I think there's definitely something about understanding the workforce, and then get out and meet them. So I'll go out and spend some time. I'll go and join a team meeting, or I'll go and work from one of their offices for a period of time. That always seems to make my AD group nervous. They say, "Oh, John's at Camden office today." And I'm like, "Oh, what's he doing there?" Question 5. How do you keep on top of recruitment and retention in an uncertain world whilst balancing the various demands of the DCS role? So I guess what I was thinking when I wrote this was potentially the role of the workforce role, if you're not careful, can become all-consuming. So whether we're talking about you've not got enough head teachers, or you need to invest in ed psychs, or speech and language, or probation officers, or dare I say social workers, people you line manage or people you don't manage, people outside this, in terms of you're conducting that system, how do you manage all of that whilst balancing the various other demands of the DCS role?
like Amanda's idea of focusing on gin.
Yeah, I've got really bad typing skills. I
Sorry.
put it down to the fact I've got fat fingers, but it's actually a combination of dyslexia and ADHD, which means
sorry.
Don't be. I think it's absolutely fine. I could stop and read what we're talking about. Yeah, I was just putting in there that we talk very much about retention first, so it's about making the workplace a nice place to be for those that are already with us, and creating opportunities for them to stay with us. So, you know, having progression plans in place in part of our retention strategy, etc. But focusing on recruitment as well, making sure we've got the right skill mix.
Thank you. Ashley, and then Kevin, and then we'll go to the final question.
In answer to the question, I guess that recruitment and retention is one of the many diverse responsibilities of a DCS, isn't it? And I guess for me, the key thing is what you said about getting the right direct reports in, the right ADs in. So in the short term, if you have to do some clearing out, that's what needs to happen. But then it's an area of work where you have to have a really good person leading on it, probably, so that hopefully you don't have to spend a disproportionate amount of time on it yourself. But in the short term, you might have to spend a disproportionate amount of time to get it sorted out. But it's one of many things, isn't it? It's the conducting the orchestra thing you were talking about. It's one example of that.
Thank you, Ashley. Kevin?
I think it's been touched on earlier when we were talking about how we got kids in year 11, 12, our future social workers and things like that. When we've been going to visit universities, and for our students that started placement a month ago, I went to give a speech to a group of them, and I think it's about realising that, well, we've employed 129 ASYEs this year, you know, KCC. Fundamentally, that's the only way you can recruit social workers at the moment. But we're also taking the approach that social workers can work in early help. So we're sort of looking at how we can meet university students, and it's not just about social work career. You might have to start your career somewhere else before you get into it whilst you're qualified, you know, so thinking flexibly. So I think the biggest thing has been the contribution to ADCS, which has been trying to look at a national strategy towards approaching government about the challenges around retention recruitment. And that is everyone's, when you see a national issue, you've got to do it together. So I think it's no point trying to fix your part of the business, because it's not going to work. And what we've seen as well from our experience of Ofsted is that our social work has become more appointable for other people. We're surrounded by authorities that requires improvement and inadequate, and our outstanding social workers that have been put on their branding has meant they can negotiate really high costs, salaries with other local authorities. So it bites you in the butt, basically, when you get that grading sometimes. So the fact is that there's no win, you know, in that sense. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't, sort of thing. So the strongest thing you can do is nationally try and deal with it.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Dion, and then the final question, I think.
So I think, just adding to Kevin's point, it's also about raising the profile, particularly of social work, and to move away from the negative media stereotypes about social workers. So using your voice to influence in that sphere is also really important, I would suggest.
Okay, thank you, Dion. Joe, did you want to come in?
No, let's move on.
Let's grab the last question. So we've talked a lot today about, you know, workforce in its widest sense, right? But as the DCS, you will now be in receipt of guilty knowledge, okay? Because your AD will have told you, or your principal social worker will have told you. So what are you gonna do about that in the statutory role as DCS to mitigate the risk? So worst case scenario, you're stacking cases, you're risk assessing cases, and you're stacking them because you've not got enough people to do the work. Andrea.
I mean, this is probably a very operational response, but I think that's where we need to think about partnership, but also system working. So, and I have been in that experience that you described, not stacking cases, but having to think very differently about allocations and how work and children will have an identified allocated statutory social worker. And that does require a system response, and it requires a system response in terms of meeting with the partnership to think about what is happening in terms of that increased demand, because quite often that is not just about retention and recruitment, it's also about the demand that's coming into the local authority. And there's something around thresholds, there's something around how you communicate with the partnership, the pressures that are being experienced, so that you share, a bit like what was said earlier on, that you share that experience so that actually people can jointly plan and manage the risks of children. And then there's something about how you internally look at the workforce, and you get, and this I think is about communication. And I think somebody said earlier on in your example there, which was an excellent example of come and talk to us as a DCS, come and talk to us an AD, because quite often the solutions for exactly that example can come from the workforce themselves. So they can actually, and certainly my experience of being under that exact pressure was that the staff themselves were able to come up with some really innovative ideas about how we manage that work. And I think in social care, I can speak more about social care than education, we create invisible walls around children that go through the journey of a child through social care, and that allocation and struggling to allocate is a really good example of where we might not have enough social workers that are sitting at the front of our system, but actually we've got a wealth of social workers that might be sitting at that other end in terms of our fostering services, our adoption services, etc. And there's something about that strategic response that actually every child is everybody's business. So, I suppose in terms of an operational and strategic response, it's about looking at how you predict it, how you see that coming in terms of your demand. And I've put in the comments box about the data and the information in terms of forecasting, so that something about understanding the demographics of your workforce when you know that you've got a number of people that are coming from retirement, or you've got a number of people who are likely to be seeking promotions. All of those things create the gaps in the workforce that result in exactly what you've described there around caseloads. And then once you're forecasting, thinking about what you would need, and it might be things like the social work academy, it might be something around how you carve up the system in terms of the allocation of work. But yeah, so I think the strategy has to be about how you can forward plan as well as how you deal with the immediate crisis, and that's about knowing yourself really well, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for that, Andrew. I can see we've still got some hands up. I'm very conscious we're running over now. Can we go to more questions, or do we need to bring the session to a close?
I think we've just got time for perhaps one more observation,
okay,
John.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah. Magella?
I'll be quick. I was just something you touched on earlier, John, but I think the first thing to do is about not owning that responsibility totally, letting your chief executive know, let your lead member know that actually we have an issue. I guess getting to the crux of what the issue is about: recruitment, it's about retention, it's about increase in demand, and working with sort of, if it's an increase in demand from police or certain areas, where's your work with the police, and doing that really sort of, I guess, strategic work with partners, sharing that responsibility, putting it on the radar. What do we need to do? And if it's about recruitment and actually you're losing workers, what's the commitment from your chief exec that we're going to need to increase costs to certain areas? We need that extra budget to get us over this. So yeah, I guess having that understanding where it's from.
Thank you, Magella. Okay, slightly over time, but that just brings us to the end of today's session from myself. So I hope that was what you were expecting. I hope that was helpful. It just reiterates to myself today that there is no instruction book, and there is no single way to tackle either this work or this role, for the reasons that you've all pointed out. So just from myself, I'd just like to thank you all for inviting me to speak with you today. It's been really interesting from my point of view as well, and I've certainly learned stuff as well.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Joe, as well. I'm just going to pass over to Chris to have the last word from the group.
Thanks, Louise. Joe, and John. I think it's been really difficult for me because I wanted to say so much, but I was too busy scribbling. So I left it to colleagues to take forward. And I think the two things that struck me, Joe, was around having the short and long-term engagement, short and long-term planning, short and long-term view. So it's always thinking in the medium to long term and having an eye on operation, having an eye on the strategic, but never losing the focus. And I think that was key that came out of it. The thing that struck me was around the totality of workforce. Joe, when you said that, it's not just children's services, it's the service within the local authority that actually focuses on children. So everybody's got the responsibility to review and step forward. So I thought that was really cleverly woven in. I like the idea of Lego, John, so I'm going to steal that. So that's going to be my tool of choice because it hits many points. So you're talking about efficiency, you're talking about sufficiency, but you're also talking about vision and adaptability, because it didn't say that two members couldn't work together to make that tower bigger. You didn't give any parameters around that. So it was really interesting about collaboration, about being collegiate, about having the ability to negotiate. There's so much in 10 Legos. So I'm going to nick that. So thank you very much for that. I think the golden thread around no recipe and there's no manual for this role is key. We've heard that week after week, whether it's in my own individual mentor sessions or whether it's in this group session, there is no manual. And every local authority area will be different. And we've spoken about that throughout this process. The thing that struck me was around systems leadership. That came through abundantly clear. Whether we're going to have a debate about contextual safeguarding, as I would call it, when you spoke about probation and it's everybody's business, whether it's the butcher or the baker, everybody's got a role to play in the service of supporting children and young people to have the best life that they can possibly have. And it doesn't fall to social workers, doesn't fall to educationalists. It's also about the community and how that all comes together. And so I really welcome that journey. I think the challenge from Kevin and Johnny around Ofsted is going to be a perennial problem, and you highlighted that perfectly, John. Around you've got to get it right. There is no half gaps. We can be very principled as much as we want, but it may be that we don't have a job at the end of the day. So we really got to balance that operational delivery, strategic delivery, keeping our members on side, keeping the politicians on side, but also having a clear eye on what it is we're trying to do to protect some of the most vulnerable groups of young people, but also those that are thriving and doing really, really well, and not to lose sight of that. So thank you both for that. Hopefully I've captured most of what you've said. I've got a whole ream of stuff that I'm going to keep for myself, primarily the Lego. So thanks again.
Well done, Chris. Yeah, so thanks from the team again.